Good evening and welcome to this event, which is launching two books tonight. One by the Finland-Swedish poet Tua Forsström, who's in Helsinki, and she'll be reading from her new collection, I Walked On Into the Forest in Swedish, followed by Anna Crowe in St. Andrews, introducing and reading her translations from Wild Creature, the final book by Joan Margarit, who died last year. And the original poems will be read in Catalan by the writer Josep Llobera, who is in Mallorca. Both of these books were published in November last year, when this event was to have taken place, but it had to be postponed due to disruptions caused by Storm Joan. We had no electricity for 4 days, so apologies to anyone who was wanting to watch it then. Bloodaxe has published Tua Forsström's and Joan Margarit's poetry in English translation for many years. Tua's since 1990 and Joan's since 2006. In fact, 4 books by each poet. We'd like to thank the Instituto Cervantes and Fili, the Finnish Literature Exchange, for their support for both of these books. And we're presenting this evening, and also Fili for support for previous books we've published by Tua Forsström and other poets from Finland. Now, Tua Forsström is a visionary Finland-Swedish poet who's become Finland's most celebrated contemporary poet. She's from the Swedish-speaking part of Finland. Her poetry draws its sonorous and plangent music from the landscapes of Finland, seeking harmony between the troubled human heart and a threatened natural world. Her new book focuses on the themes of death and grief, and in particular, the death of a granddaughter. The book's subtitle is Poems for a Little Girl. She achieved wider recognition outside Finland with her 6th collection, Snow Leopard, published in Finland in 1987, notably in Sweden and in Britain, where David McDuff's translation, published by Bloodaxe in 1990, received a Poetry Book Society Translation Award. Bloodaxe subsequently published 2 further books by her, including her trilogy, I Studied Once at a Wonderful Faculty. Fast forward to 2021, and Bloodaxe published David McDuff's translation of her 12th book of poetry, I Walked On Into the Forest, which we're hearing from tonight, which is also a Poetry Book Society translation choice. We're going to read the original language first, and then followed by, the English translation first, followed by the poem in the original language. And tonight I'm going to be reading David McDuff's translations of Tua's poems from the new book. The first section of the book is untitled poems, numbered poems. So we'll just read those without titles. The first one. The unbroken murmur from Mannerheim Street through the night. Count 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Breathe in, breathe out. Count ambulances and sheep and twinkling stars and everything in the world that disappears in order to become something else I can't explain. My cousin told me on the phone yesterday that the forest is burning again in southern Australia and the mice are running away quickly on their paws.
Det jämna bruset från Mannerheimvägen genom natten. Räkna 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Andas in, andas ut. Räkna ambulanser och får och gnistrande stjärnor och allt i världen som försvinner bort för att bli något annat. Jag kan inte förklara. Min kusin berättade igår i telefon att skogen brinner igen i södra Australien och mössen springer undan fort på sina tassar.
Gravity stops here. I shut the door on I don't know what kind of darkness. Someone has cut the grass and it smells. The heart is a lake with waves where photographs are reflected for a moment and sink softly, and the remains of the day sink slowly and change us and mix up the pictures while they sink.
Gravitationen upphör här. Jag stänger dörren mot vad jag vet inte vad för slags mörker. Någon har slagit gräset och det doftar. Hjärtat är en sjö med vågor där fotografier speglas en stund och sjunker långsamt och återstoden av dagen sjunker och förändrar oss, förväxlar bilderna medan de sjunker.
As a friend, I want to give you courage as you give me courage. As one goes up to someone at a bus stop, as the dreams warn and console us. A girl packed her rucksack to travel to northern lights and volcanoes. It is snowing on the little horse that pulls the sled through the snow, and love is the other side of sorrow. Someone ought to take it all in hand. I write to you about the little horses, and that the days grew long, and I shop for the usual old things at the K-market. And everyone complains about the dark and the hurricanes and the slippery sidewalks, and last summer when it rained nearly every day and the glaciers are melting.
Som en vän vill jag inge dig mod, så som du inger mig mod. Som man går fram till någon på busshållplatsen, som drömmarna varnar och tröstar oss. En flicka packade sin ryggsäck för att resa till norrsken och vulkaner. Det snöar på den lilla hästen som drar släden genom snön, och kärleken är sorgens andra sida. Någon borde hålla sin hand över allt sammans. Jag skriver till dig om de små hästarna och att dagarna blev långa, och jag handlar det gamla vanliga i K-butiken, och alla människor klagar över mörkret och orkanerna och halkan och förra sommaren när det regnade nästan varje dag och glaciärerna smälter.
If the dream has a home, it is perhaps the shore here, with blackbirds in the evenings, in the shadow of the mountain, where we hold each other's hands and play and are always the same age. I don't know anymore. Many bird species that sing wonderfully mimic other bird species, and a tramcar and mobile phones ringing. Do you remember how we swam and flew?
Om drömmen har ett hem, är det kanske stranden här med koltrast i skuggan av berget om kvällarna, där vi håller varandras hand och leker och är lika gamla alltid. Jag vet inte mer. Många fågelarter som sjunger underbart härmar andra fågelarter och en spårvagn och mobiltelefoner som ringer. Minns du hur vi simmade och flög?
And this is moving into the next part of the book. This is a poem called On Learning and Not Forgetting. A raccoon can unscrew the lid off a jar and pull the handle down and open the door. There are many wise and wonderful creatures. In captivity, they forget and look at us with their large night-active eyes. I know that when misfortune strikes us and takes what we love most, the person doesn't think many thoughts. Why did it have to be her who is little? Why not me? You think so persistently with all your heart, all your soul, and all your reason. You continue to thumb through the newspaper in the hope of news from other countries where little girls go to school with flowery rucksacks and stickers and mobile phones, and the tram car is filled with a loud twitter.
Om att lära sig och inte glömma. En tvättbjörn kan skruva locket av en burk och vrida ner handtaget och öppna en dörr. Det finns många kloka och underbara djur. I fångenskapen glömmer de och ser på oss med sina stora nattaktiva ögon. Jag vet att när olyckan drabbar oss och tar det mest älskade, tänker en människa inte många tankar. Varför just hon som var liten? Varför inte jag? Man tänker så ständigt av allt sitt hjärta, hela sin själ och allt sitt förstånd. Man fortsätter bläddra i tidningen i hopp om nyheter från andra länder där små flickor går till skolan med blommiga ryggsäckar och klistermärken och telefoner, och spårvagnen fylls av ett högt kvitter.
Now the book, Tua's book includes a passage of Emerson, and so the poems are partly conversation with him from his journals. This poem is untitled. Don't think that I blame you, Emerson. Just after the death of your son, you wrote about all he touched. In the morning night, heartbroken, at sunrise, when the cocks began to crow. Now I already say it was the year Vanessa died. Yet I was startled at what you thought grief taught you. I cannot get it nearer to me. Later on, you don't mention your son and write only about him. You grieve about having lost even grief, and all misfortunes seem to be of equal value. There is neither here nor there. The cocks crow, everything flickers and glitters, and one buys a new calendar every year.
Tro inte att jag klandrar dig, Emerson. Strax efter din pojkes död skrev du om allt vad han rörde vid. På morgonnatten, förkrossad, i soluppgången när tupparna satte igång att skräna. Nu säger jag redan, det var det året Vanessa dog. Ändå häpnade jag över vad du anser att sorgen lärde dig. Citat, närmare kommer jag inte. I fortsättningen nämner du inte din pojke och skriver endast om honom. Du sörjer över att ha förlorat också sorgen, och alla olyckor är lika mycket värda. Det finns varken här eller där. Tupparna gal, allt flimrar och glittrar, och man köper en ny kalender varje år.
The last poem we're going to read is also titled On Learning and Not Forgetting. This summer, there were butterflies everywhere. They stood like a cloud above the oregano around the ugly garden table. They were completely unafraid, settled down on my arm with wings folded together, a thin dark flake that quivered. It seemed to be part of their nature to quiver, and they had clear little hairy faces. There were peacock butterflies and cabbage moths and 8 other species that I recognized from the chart that we taped to the closet door in the kitchen.
I somras var det fjärilar överallt. De stod som ett moln över oreganon kring det fula trädgårdsbordet. De var alldeles orädda, slog sig ner på min arm med hopfällda vingar, en tunn mörk flaga som darrade. Det verkade höra till deras natur att darra, och de hade tydliga små gludna ansikten. Det var påfågelögon och kolfjäril och 8 andra arter som jag kände igen från planschen som vi tejpade upp på skåpdörren i köket.
Thank you, Tua. And Tua's going to join us all in a discussion at the end of the event after we've heard from Anna Crowe and Josep reading from Joan Margarit's book, Wild Creature. So thank you very much, Tua.
Thank you, Neil.
Now, Joan Margarit was born in 1938 and he died last year. He was one of Spain's major modern writers. He first published his work in Spanish, but over the past 4 decades became known for his mastery of the Catalan language and was Spain's most widely acclaimed contemporary poet. Like Finland, Spain has its own so-called minority language and literature, in this case Catalan, as well as Galician and Basque language and literature. Joan Margarit's final collection in English shows us a poet writing at the end of his life, facing up to approaching death with courage, humility, and even humor. Confronting loss is one of his enduring themes, and many of these poems do just that, but there are even more that celebrate love and everyday domesticity. I came across Joan Margarit's work by chance in 2005 when I was at Stanza, Scotland's International Poetry Festival in St Andrews. We were staying at a B&B where another of the guests was a Mexican poet, Pedro Serrano, who was reading with Joan Margarit with Anna Crowe, who is the translator of both poets. So after having breakfast with Pedro, I went and picked up a ticket to their event. And also there was Naomi Jaffa from Alba Poetry Festival. And at the end, we both went up to Joan and Anna and made an immediate plan. Anna at that stage had only translated a small body of work by Joan, but we said if she would translate a whole book of his work, Bloodaxe would publish it, and then Alba would launch it the following year, which is what happened. While they were in Alba, Pamela Robertson-Pierce filmed them reading and talking about poems from that book, which was called Tugs in the Fog, Selected Poems. And that film was included in our DVD anthology, In Person, World Poets, in 2008. Now, before we hear from Anna and Josep reading from Wild Creature tonight, we're going to show a short excerpt from that film. And here, Joan talks about his poem and reads, The Eyes in the Rearview Mirror, which was written out of grief after the death of his beloved handicapped daughter, Joanna. And then Anna will read her translation in the film, and you'll hear Joan reading the original poem in Catalan in his inimitable style. So we're going to see that very short reading now, and after that we'll go straight into the reading by Anna and Josep from Wild Creature.
Després d'aquest naixement complicat, dur, trist, angoixant, desesperant, la vida va resoldre, com sempre passa, la major part dels problemes.
After this difficult, depressing, anguished birth, life resolved itself into a kind of order, as always happens.
Aquella noia, la Joana, que havia de ser el nostre desastre i la nostra desesperació, diem-ho ja molt ràpidament, ha estat l'amor de la nostra vida i el sentit de la nostra vida.
This girl whose birth was caused us such despair and such distress, very soon became our great love of our life and gave it its meaning.
Aquest poema que llegirem ara, als ulls del retrovisor, és el poema que canta la bellesa de la Joana, la bellesa d'aquest amor que mai ens haguéssim pensat trobar en aquesta filla.
This poem, The Eyes in the Rearview Mirror, sings of that girl and, oh, I'm sorry, Joanne, sing of oblidat el seguint.
El sentit.
El sentit.
Ens ha donat sentit a
Sí.
la nostra vida.
And she gave a meaning to their life.
Comences tu.
Sí. And I'm going to read it first. The eyes in the rearview mirror. We have both grown accustomed, Joanna, for this slowness when you lean on your crutches and climb out of the car to start off a sally of car horns and their abstract abuse. Your company makes me happy, and the smile of a body so far from what was always called beauty, that tedious beauty so far off. I'm sorry, Joanna. I have exchanged it for the seductiveness of tenderness that lights up the gap that reason left in your face. And if I look at myself in the rearview mirror, I see a pair of eyes I do not easily recognize, for in them there shines the love left by looks and light, the shadow of everything I have seen, and the peace your slowness reflects back to me. So great is their wealth that the eyes in the rear-view mirror don't seem to be mine.
Els ulls del retrovisor. Ja estem acostumats, els dos, Joanna, que aquesta lentitud, quan recolzes les crosses i vas baixant del cotxe, desperti les botzines i el seu insult abstracte. Em fa feliç la teva companyia i el somriure d'un cos que està molt lluny del que sempre s'ha dit de la bellesa, la penosa bellesa, tan distant. L'he canviat per la seducció de la tendresa que il·lumina el buit deixat per la raó al teu rostre. I quan em miro en el retrovisor, no veig uns ulls senzills de reconèixer, perquè hi brilla l'amor que hi han deixat tantes mirades, i la llum, i l'ombra del que he vist, i la pau que reflecteix la teva lentitud, que és dins de mi. És tan gran la riquesa, que no sembla que aquests ulls del mirall puguin ser els meus.
Right. I would like to thank Neil, first of all, and the whole of the Bloodaxe team for producing this really, really beautiful book. I just want to show you the cover, which is a painting from the cave at Altamira. And many of the poems in the book refer to the cave paintings. We worked on the book up until 2 weeks before Joan died, and he was very happy with it. So Joanna remained for Joan and Mariona the light of their lives, and although she died when she was just 30, Joan would go on writing about her until his own death. Josep and I are going to read, first of all, Memory's Punishment, where Joan castigates memory for its tendency to exaggerate past happiness. He's a poet who never spares himself. And the lost elm tree with the loss of all the bird song is one of the most poignant images for the silencing of a life. Memory's Punishment. We used to come cutting across the cruelty of the summer drought, a kind of homeland. At Tariga, we entered by a road where the first thing we saw was the elm, facing the swimming pools, like the character in a fairy tale. Its shade protected us, and the knowledge that in the water Joanna could swim freely like the other girls. They closed the pools, and the elm died. The dry stump, its 3 boughs lopped, remained. The silent song of hundreds of birds, of the wind murmuring among leaves, of the echoing voices from those happy days, the indignity of exaggerating memories. And can I say how very grateful I am to Josep for volunteering to read the originals in Catalan. Over to you, Josep.
No, thank you. It's an honor. Càstig del record. Venien travessant la crueltat de l'estiu de Sallà, una mena de pàtria. A Tàrrega hi entràvem per una carretera, on el primer que vèiem era l'hom, davant de les piscines, igual que el personatge d'un conte ens protegia la seva ombra. I sempre que dins l'aigua la Joana n'andava lliure com les altres nenes. Van tancar les piscines i l'home es va morir. Quedaven secs la solla entre els monyons, el silenci del cant de centenars d'ocells, del murmuri del vent entre les fulles, de les veus ressonant-hi aquells dies feliços. La intimitat d'exagerar records.
The next poem looks back to Joan's childhood during the aftermath of the Spanish Civil War, when to speak or publish Catalan or write it was proscribed by the dictatorship. But the poem reveals how Joan's rural, very poor childhood gave him a solid sense of humanity that he never lost. Through pain. I've never forgotten the blow to the back of my head from a Guardia Civil who told me loudly and harshly, "Speak a Christian tongue, boy." Until I was in my 40s, the police would conduct their questioning using torture, only in Castilian. But through so many humiliations, before the words, something else reached me, gentle and indestructible, as clear as nothing else would ever be. It came from a place that I think is childhood. Sometimes I feel it mixed with music, like 10 or 15 notes that suddenly move me, but I don't know why or since when. As though it were a tomb with no name, to which for love's sake I have always brought roses. It is the strength and light of something unknown to me. It warns me, protects me from a place that I do not love, from a pointless rancor, from myself, from others, from some dangerous indifference. It's in my poems. For that reason, too, I've written them in Castilian.
A través del dolor. Mai no he oblidat el clatellot d'un guàrdia, dient-me fort i sec. Habla en cristiano, niño. Fins als meus 40 anys, la policia va fer interrogatoris amb tortures, només en castellà. Però a través de tantes humiliacions, abans que les paraules va arribar una altra cosa, suau i indestructible. Tan lúcida com res ja no ho seria mai. va arribar des d'un lloc que penso que és la infància. A vegades la sento barrejada a la música, com 10 o 15 notes que de sobte em commouen, però no sé per què ni des de quan. Com si fos una tomba sense nom, a la qual per l'amor sempre du roses. És la força, la llum d'una cosa que ignoro. M'avisa, em protegeix d'algun lloc que no estimo, d'una inútil rancúnia, de mi mateix, dels altres, d'alguna perillosa indiferència. És en els meus poemes, que per això també els he escrit en castellà.
We're going to read a poem called In the Early Morning, which I find one of Joan's most moving poems, in which the image of bare feet comes to stand both for approaching death and also the shared intimacy and kindness of marriage. And going to Paris, as those who have read the first Bloodaxe collection, Tugs in the Fog, will know, used to be synonymous with the idea of freedom during the oppressive years of Franco's dictadura. In the early morning, I have turned off my light and lain down. You go on reading beside me. What I'm doing is turning my back on the world, but I know that where I'm gazing, we will end up going with bare feet. These feet of ours that have searched for each other beneath the sheets for such a long time. There is no gesture as warm as this. You and I reading in bed early in the morning. We're like the headlights on the deux chevaux that used to carry us along tiny roads in a world without motorways, where we had to stop for the night when going to Paris.
De matinada. He apagat el llum i m'he tombat. Tu continues al costat, llegint. El que faig és donar l'esquena al món, però sé que cap on estic mirant i acabarem anant amb els peus nus. Els nostres peus que es busquen des de fa tant de temps sota els llençols. No hi ha cap gest tan càlid com aquest. Tu i jo, llegint de matinada al llit. Són com els fars dels dolços cavalls que ens duia, avançant per petites carreteres, d'un món sense autopistes, on havíem de fer nit quan anàvem a París.
As well as being Spain's most foremost poet, Joan Margarit was also an eminent architect. In this next poem, the poet envisages how the idea of the protective wall may have taken hold. Well, I've already said that I would like to thank Neil for finding that beautiful image from the Altamira cave in the north of Spain. So here is the poem and the wall. Beyond the horizon, there rises a winter's day. The poplar's black branches, the cold and rosy sun has lit up the stone wall of the house. It's an innocent and dangerous hour. It must have been so too for those who made a fire in caves that smelled of smoke, excrement, and slaughtered animals. I think of a day hundreds of thousands of years ago, and a brightness similar now to this. In the bleakness of the cavern, there rose up from the depths of a gaze the protective idea of the wall. Someone among the shadows was gazing at paintings or signs made on the rock and lit by the fire. The thought grew like a great tree beneath the stars. At the same time as there arose the warmth still far off and indistinct, of the house. Watching how the day is being born, I think gratefully of architecture and of the first people who could listen to some hexameters from the Odyssey. I have always kept faith with the poem and with the wall.
El poema i el mur. Darrere l'horitzó s'alça un dia d'hivern. Negres blanques de l'alber, el sol rosat i fred ha il·luminat el mur de pedra de la casa. És una hora innocent i perillosa. Deia ser-ho també per als que feien foc, a dir les coves amb olor de fum, excrements i animals esquarterats. Penso en un dia, centenars de milers d'anys endarrere, i una claror semblant a aquesta d'ara. La severitat de la caverna sorgia des del fons d'una mirada, la suposició protectora del mur. Algú, entre les ombres, mirava, il·luminats per la follera, dibuixos o senyals fets a la roca. El pensament creixia, com un gran arbre sota les estrelles, alhora que sorgia l'escalfor, encara lluny, confusa, de la casa. Veient com neix el dia, agraït, penso en l'arquitectura, i en els primers que van poder escoltar alguns hexàmetres de l'Odissea. He estat sempre fidel al poema i al mur.
The next poem is called Vincent Van Gogh, and here the poet pays tribute to Van Gogh's wonderfully down-to-earth vision of the world. It's also a plea for seeing death honestly and simply as an end of a life, with no need to erect theories about transcendence. Vincent van Gogh, he must have known it. Of the real world, the most difficult truth to understand is that life ends with simplicity, because nothing exists outside the real world. A tree, a mountain, silence and rain are forever true. They have no need of such turgid stuff as theories. A pretentious world that believes that death, which means no more than that a life is ending, is a final and transcendent truth. Painter of firmaments, clogs, beds, chairs, and fields of wheat that crows fly over, Vincent van Gogh did not let himself be fooled.
Vincent Van Gogh. Ell devia saber-ho, del món real, la seva veritat més difícil de comprendre. És la senzillesa que s'allava la vida, perquè res no existeix fora del món real. Un arbre, una muntanya, el silenci i la pluja són sempre veritat. No necessiten allò tan tèrbol de les teories. Un món pretensiós que pensa que la mort, que no vol dir res més que acabar una vida, és una veritat final i transcendent. Pintor de firmaments, sabates, llits, cadires i camps de blat sobrevolats per corps. Vincent Van Gogh no es va deixar enganar.
And now we're going to read the last poem. This is Courtyard Song, and this is addressed to the poet's wife, to Mariona. The Green Courtyard has featured in several other poems where the spirit of Joanna seems to hover. Now the poet contemplates his own approaching death and looks to the time beyond, when all we have are his poems. Courtyard Song. There's a quotation from Edward Thomas to start with. Aspens must shake their leaves, and men must hear, but need not listen more than to my rhymes. It's beginning to rain very slowly. You and I, in the shelter of the porch, listen to the drops beating as though following a partitura on the ivy leaves and on the large, serious, classical foliage of the aspidistras. But that's not what I was wanting to say in these lines, though it may all belong to the same story. For the first time, like a truth, I felt that my time was now coming to an end. We cannot forget what a brutal mix of the toughest happiness and limitless sadness our life has been. Today, just like this porch, we are still real. Two old people who are talking in this green courtyard while listening to the rain. But now, the only one able to hear them will be he who one day reads this poem.
Cançó del pati. Els follangres han de sacsejar les fulles i els homes ho senten sense escoltar, com fan amb els meus versos. Comença a ploure molt a poc. Tu i jo, a sota el porxo, escoltem les gotes que colpegen, com si seguissin una partitura. Les fulles de les heures i els grans i seriosos fullatges clàssics de les aspidistres. Però no era això que pretenia dir en aquests versos, per molt que tot pertanyi a la mateixa història. Per primera vegada, com una veritat, he sentit que el meu temps ja s'estava acabant. No podem oblidar quina brutal barreja d'alegria duríssima i tristor sense límits ha estat la nostra vida. Avui, com aquest porxo, encara som reals. Dos vells que estan parlant en aquest pati verd mentre escolten la pluja. Però que ja només podrà sentir-los el que un dia llegeixi aquest poema. That was good, I think.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Josep and Anna. Powerful readings from both books, I think. We're now going to move into a discussion. Anna mentioned the cover of the Joan Margarit book. I'd just like to show that a bit more clearly so you can see this marvelous cave painting on the cover. And this is Tua's book with this wonderful Finnish landscape on it by Phil Aiken. I'd like to start off by saying Tua's title in English, I Walked On Into the Forest, has a much shorter title in Swedish, which is actually the English for notes, the Swedish for the word notes. And David McDuff isn't here tonight, but I'd like to ask Tua whether she could talk about how she works with David and how it was that it was decided to give the English translation a completely different title.
So, as far as I remember, both David and you, Neil, and I were pretty of the same opinion when we were pondering that original Swedish title, Anteckningar, Notes, which was I had it was important for me to have that, to use that title in Swedish, because I felt that this book of poetry somehow didn't really, I mean, to me it wasn't really conventional poetry. It was more like it was so difficult to write. It was the most difficult book I have ever written, and I hope I will never have to write a book like that, because it was awful to write and get finished, and when I had to find a title for it, I felt that all, like, all literary titles would have been wrong. I mean, like, any elaborate or sophisticated or very, very beautiful title would have been wrong, because in a way, this book really consisted of very small, like, notes that I took, and that was the only thing I could write at that time. So to me it was somehow important to use that title. But then we had a little discussion, you and David and me, and we were all really spontaneously thought that in English that would be notes would be a title that would be awfully like vague, or it wouldn't tell anybody anything, and so forth. And you do not want a book title to be to work that way either. And I really I didn't really know what to do. But as far as I know, you and David came up with this one.
I think it was David's idea, actually. He came up with that line.
Idea.
Yeah, and I thought, yes.
And you liked it.
And I liked it. And I think it works
very well.
But
then it was David's idea. And I was very grateful about it, because I thought it's somehow congenial. It's somehow congenial. And especially as I had the possibility to use that subtitle, Poems for a Little Girl, which like kind of connected to that original situation in which it was written. So that was the story of it. About it.
Now his translation is very congenial. I like that you used that word.
Yes.
He translates very close to the Swedish, and
yes.
he creates very strong equivalents in terms of rhythm, doesn't he, in the English?
Yes.
How he has translated that book, particularly in that book, I think.
Even I was going to say, Neil, even more and more so now, as I have followed his translation work so long, that I would say more and more for each book. He's really like, there's something very, very fantastic that happens because even he has such a tremendous experience and CV that is really, I mean, incredible. He still somehow develops all the time, and he gets closer and closer and closer to the original text he handles, And I think that's somehow admirable that you can you move on.
Mm.
Yeah.
Now, turning to Anna, we have another translator who's worked with a poet for many, many years, with Joan, as well as other poets in Catalan and Spanish. We can't really have, or would you like to talk about how your approach to translating Joan from Catalan?
Yes, I had to learn very early on to translate him exactly down to the letter, because I think when I started translating him, I couldn't believe how harsh and hard and unforgiving some of the poems were. And I think I had a kind of instinct that I needed to sort of gentle him and soften it. And he immediately pounced on this and said, you know, you mustn't do this. It's got to be the way I say it. And I learned that lesson very early on. It was a very valuable lesson because I was only just beginning to be a translator in those days. So I had to learn very fast and very quickly to get that book ready for the following year. And it has been a wonderful honor, and I've enjoyed it very, very much, these 15 years of, you know, almost daily emails from Joan with yet more poems, because he is a very prolific writer and he's written so many books. And we also very much enjoyed putting into Catalan a volume of R.S. Thomas poems as well. That was a great pleasure to do. Excuse me. Can I just say how much I have enjoyed reading and listening to a reading of the poems. And can I just say what I think, although these are poems of great grief and loss, that loss and suffering in the private dimension, I love the way it becomes part of what we're, so many of us, feeling about the loss and what is happening in the natural world. And I love the way that this very personal poetry opens out into the natural world. And this wonderful title of yours, Walking into the Forest, walking on into the forest, that is walking on, that wonderful sense of I'm going to go on walking and I'm going into the forest. And I love that. I think that's just splendid. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, in fact, Joan, in some of those poems, he talks about the natural world as being the real world. It's the world he holds on to, isn't it, in those poems?
Yes, and I think growing up where he did in the countryside outside Lleida, it's a very harsh way of it. I think it's called, technically it's known as dry farming, where you have to do a lot of irrigation. And one of the poems in the book is a lovely one about his memory of being a child and clapping his hands in delight when out with his grandfather, when his grandfather opens the sluice gate and lets the water into all the little gullies that they have made to water these fields. And I mean, they were very, very, very poor. And there's another poem that remembers how in those early days after the Civil War, they had no electricity at night. There was no power for hours, and it got dark, and yet his mother and his grandmother went on sewing or knitting or cooking in the dark until finally, suddenly, the power would come back and they would all cheer. And Joan particularly cheered because he could listen to the radio, and he always had a great love of music, mostly classical music, particularly Schubert and Beethoven and Bach. But he loved the the tangos and the popular songs, and he was very, very fond of the French chansons, you know, Jacques Brel and Georges Brassens and so on, and Léo Ferré. He loved those songs, and all that comes into his poetry, and his poetry is very musical, and I could feel that when I was translating it always, that there was this music. And in fact, he said to me once, I realized very soon that you and I are singing the same music. So I felt very delighted that he said that.
That notion of singing the same music is also, I think, part of his engagement with English literature. I mean, you mentioned him translating R.S. Thomas into Catalan. His work was influenced by Thomas Hardy, and we heard a poem tonight with an epigraph from Edward Thomas, didn't we?
Yes.
And interestingly, Tua, in your book, we've got sections quoted from Emerson, and you talking back to Emerson. There's also W.G. Sebald, Austerlitz. Do you want to say something about the relevance of Sebald and Emerson to the new book?
You mean me?
Yeah.
And Auden also.
Yes, Auden too.
Well, I have for many years I have felt that the great writers I have had the privilege to read and get acquainted to. I have always felt that I owe them something. I want to I would like to say thanks, and I owe them something. And I would love to be able to give something back, but that I can't. But what I can, I feel, is that when I read these classical authors, which I read very frequently, what I can do is that I can just I can like start a dialogue with them. I can they write something and I say, do you really, can that be so? Or can, and then I feel free. I really feel free to also take an opposite. What is it? Is it in English? Oppositive, position. I can also argue with them. I can whatever, but I have always had this I have always have this relationship to literature, that the great literature exists because it wants to be used by us. It wants to be used. It really wants to be used, and those little dialogues, small dialogues, and other like dialogues. Anyway, when I pull other not only writers but also artists and musicians and so forth. When I pull them into my world, then I think I feel free to talk to them. And so I have a lot of, I mean, my books are pretty crowded with things like that.
Yes, and they become absorbed into the text of the book, don't they? Yeah.
Yes.
We've had some comments coming through on the chat, both from Ireland, actually, the first two. But the poet Moya Cannon says, "Thank you for bringing these beautiful poems across the borders of language." And Kerry Hardy says, "Anna, I'm so glad you didn't soften the brutality of the poems. It was really important." So we're getting some feedback from the audience here. I'm conscious that Josep has been part of this event, and I thought, since Josep, you're of the younger generation of Catalan writers, you didn't have the same struggle that Joan had. And I was wondering how you relate to his work in particular, or the example that he's given Catalan writers from the younger generation, from your generation.
Yes, well, first of all, well, I think that when you have this desire to write, and of course you can't really use your native language, it can be frustrating. But at the same time, I think that he did well in just writing in Spanish if it was his only option at the time. And then maybe translating some of his poems into Catalan and so forth. But I think that now, for instance, the funny thing is that I had a Catalan upbringing. I've been taught Catalan language at school. We have our own Institute of Catalan Language, which is called Institut Ramon Llull, which takes care of the standards of the language. But even then, now the thing is that we know also Castilian, or Spanish. We are taught English from the early age, from the very beginning. And for instance, myself, that I've lived in Scotland for about 6 years now, I find myself that I write in Spanish and in English and in Catalan. And funny thing is that now I have a novel written in Spanish and in English, but I still don't have anything in Catalan. Maybe hopefully will something soon. But yeah, now we have maybe too many options.
Joan was unusual in that he published his books in both languages, didn't he? Was that unusual for a writer in Spain to actually publish virtually the same books in both languages? Maybe Anna would like to comment on that.
Yes, I think it was unusual, and he received quite a lot of criticism from the ultra nationalists in Barcelona, especially. I think it was unusual, but as he says in that poem that we heard, he didn't see the point of carrying on the rancor of that grew up, because of course Catalonia suffered abominably, and in the memory, you don't have to go very far back before you come across some pretty terrible events and memories of people who lost grandparents, and never saw them again, never knew where they were buried or anything. But I think he saw that he had to overcome that and put it behind him and just tell the truth about how it was growing up. And he does tell the truth about it, the poem about through pain, through that blow to the back of the head and knocked him flying, and that the pain and the humiliations that they went through. In an earlier poem, he talks about having to kiss the flag in primary school. Every morning, every child had to march up to the front of the class and kiss the Spanish flag. And he said he can smell even now the dye that they used for this Spanish flag. But he tells it as it was, but he's not bitter about it. He just, wants to put it out there and say, this is what happened. This is what it was like to grow up at that time. But, we have to move on and we have to live together,
He started publishing in Spanish, didn't he? And then he published in Catalan. Then he was publishing in both languages. So in a sense, he was broadening his readership by writing in both languages. And one of the other poets we published for many years was the Czech poet Miroslav Holland. And he evolved a very anti-lyrical, very pared down style of writing in Czech. And he said one of the reasons for that was so he could be translated into as many languages as possible.
Oh.
So he knew that his readership in Czech would be tiny, but he wanted to reach readers all around the world. And so he loved the idea that by writing the way that he wrote, it would be so amenable for translators in other languages to actually translate him into other languages. And that really became, very, very important, particularly when his work was banned in Czechoslovakia, because they used to just do a small print run of his books and then they would say it had been published, but people then couldn't get hold of it again. So it was a form of censorship by non-availability of books. And then at one period, his books weren't available at all. He was totally banned. Which I wonder whether I could ask Tua, because Tua is on the Swedish Academy, which awards the Nobel Prize. And I know that being translated into as many languages as possible is very important for the Swedish Academy in judging the Nobel Prize. And very important, clearly, for minority languages. I was wondering whether you could say something about that, Tua, from your knowledge of that area.
Well, yes, I would say it helps if the interesting writers are translated into many languages, and usually English naturally comes first, but then of course there are also other translations that have importance, but it has some importance because it's easier for us to read. It's simply easier for us to read and get rid or get hold of that literature that we need to get acquainted with. But I would say that it's not necessary, though. I mean, if there are a few wonderful works by a wonderful writer, then somehow it will. I mean, it will turn out well. You will find those books in strange languages, and you can even have them translated in the worst case. So I don't think it's a necessary, but it helps, of course.
Yeah. Another, we've got comments come through from another writer writing in a minority language, the Welsh language poet Menna Elfyn, who says, "Diolch, thank you for the wonderful readings, poems catching so much light." So that's interesting that we've got Welsh language writers looking at tonight's event. Is there anything you might like to say to each other about the books? You've both read each other's books. I was wondering whether anything you'd like to say.
I would like to say something. Mm-hmm. I think this evening has been so extremely enlightening. So it has been really elevating, because I knew I knew our writer. I mean, I knew his name, but I hadn't read him that well. And now I got when Maria talked about him, and Anna, excuse me, Anna talked about him, and also when I heard the beautiful readings in Catalan, I somehow the world all of a sudden got larger and bigger and more exciting, and then I read for this occasion. I read an amazing winter and Wild Creatures, which are I mean, titles, or just the titles make you just, I mean, they are so wonderful titles that they sort of like start loading your imagination, or they are very, very inspiring, and I would just very much like to, I don't know, but I would very, very much like to just quote a couple of lines that have been, since I read An Amazing Winter. These two lines have been like circulating in my brain, like really since night and day. I mean, they just, and they are the finishing lines of a poem called "The Solitude of the Sea." Anna knows, and they go, and they are just the finishing. For me, the only thing that counts now is what has been sought after until death. The amazing winter of the animal deep down.
Yes.
Yes.
I
should explain for the audience also that Wild Creature is a book that combines two collections, Joanne's last two collections, Amazing Winter and then Wild Creature.
Yes.
And that was from the title, from Amazing Winter.
Yeah. So this is from both titles in a way. Yeah.
Well, when I read your earlier books, I was very struck by the way you have this dialogue with Tarkovsky, and I mean, Nostalgia is one of my favorite films, but I've not seen it for years. The other one, Solaris, I couldn't get to grips with so much. I found that a difficult film, but you write about other films of his, and it really reinvigorated longing to see Tarkovsky's films again. So I really have to thank you for that.
Nice.
I'm going to dig them out.
I'm happy about that. Then I would like to recommend if you haven't seen it lately, The Mirror. Yeah, that is wonderful.
I take note as well.
I'll get that one.
As a matter of fact, I published a book of poetry that consisted partly of letters addressed to Tarkovsky. to Andrzej, letters, my own letters addressed to Tarkovsky. And I think now afterwards, I think this is somehow a little bit touching, because he was such a difficult person. He was a terribly, terribly difficult and irritated and and I'm absolutely positive that he would have hated me writing those letters to him. And I was so, and I couldn't help being a little bit grateful about the fact that he was dead. So he couldn't
couldn't get back to you.
No, he couldn't oppose it. But yeah.
And what is your book called, Tua?
The Tarkovsky book.
Yes.
You mean yes?
Yeah, the one that book of letters.
Yes. After having spent a night among horses.
Oh yes, it's that one. That's great. That's fine.
There it is. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, that's included in the trilogy, which was published by Bloodaxe.
Yes.
And I should mention also for the audience that if you scroll down on the YouTube page, you can order tonight's books straight from Bloodaxe. Also, we've got a comment coming from Vicky Fever. We've loads of poets who've been watching tonight. Wonderful reading, she says, so memorable. Tua's poems, Joan Margaret's. And she says, Anna, such wonderful translations and your powerful readings and explanations. So we're getting a lot of poets watching tonight who are appreciating all this.
That's very
nice. I think we've probably come to an end now of our discussion. So I'd like to thank all the audience for watching, and thank Tua, Anna and Josep for taking part.
Thank you.
Make sure you don't click out of the reading at the end when we go off live. So do stay on, the three of you. And thank you very much for watching tonight. Thank you.